All right, everybody. Welcome to tonight's program. It's a Stratford Hall special, if you will. My name is Dr. Kelley Fanto Deetz. I'm the Director of Collections and Visitor Engagement at Stratford Hall in Virginia. I am a scholar of the African diaspora. I am a public historian. I'm an archaeologist, and I am passionate about the history of food and how it intersects with social and cultural and material history. So tonight I'm going to be talking about sugar, slavery, and revolution, the real history of white gold. So I was brought into this topic generally just through the lens of food, through my own experiences in kitchens. I grew up in the restaurant industry. My father was an esteemed historian and archaeologist, and I found myself blending my two passions of food and history. As an undergrad at the College of William and Mary, I went on to get my PhD at UC Berkeley, where I wrote a dissertation, which ended up being my first book, called Bound to the Fire: How Virginia's Enslaved Cooks Helped Invent American Cuisine. And it is through that book and some of my other work that I've been doing, both in the sort of publication realm as well as public programs like we have here at Stratford, where Audible reached out to me about a year and a half ago and asked if I would like to do a great courses series on the history of sugar. I had sort of adjacently talked about sugar in some of my work. Of course, my training in the history of the African diaspora, the transatlantic slave trade, is steeped with the history of sugar, but it was a big topic. And so what I decided to do is accept the wonderful invitation, and I dove pretty deeply into the really interesting and tragic history of this crop, of this ingredient. I had the help, of course, of Amy Connolly, who's my research assistant during the entire process, and I'm very proud of the work that we did. It is now found on Audible. You can find it on Amazon, and I think normally you can get like one Audible free, course or something like that a month, and so, or it's like $1 or something. So it's really not that expensive to listen to the whole program. But it ended up being about I think a 5.5 hour long course where I look at the history of sugar through different lenses. I did everything from material culture to the history of dessert to just the subtopic of rum. And it was a fascinating venture into this really important history. Tonight, I'm going to be talking about some of the lenses, some of the sort of perspectives into the history of sugar that are not commonly talked about. I'm going to bring out some of the more fascinating bits of information that I found during my research, things that haunted me at night, things that kept me going, things that have inspired me to do further research on the topic, because as any good sort of research topic goes, there are tentacles that just reach out and start touching things that you never thought you would be interested in. So tonight we're going to be talking about war, about conquest, about all of these different things, pirates, right? We're going to be talking about the ways in which sugar has drastically changed the world's history. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And again, I want to just say we do not have the chat active. So if you have a question, drop it in the Q&A. I will not be answering questions until the end of the program. I'm also going to be blocking out my face so you can just focus on the slides themselves. They're quite spectacular. And then listen to me sort of walk you through the ways in which I sort of approach the history of white gold. So give me one moment here. I'm going to share my screen. Help if I actually shared it. All right, give me a second here. I'm very, very excited about tonight's talk. I got stuck doing a handful of lectures over and over and over again the last several years. So this is a really exciting moment for me to be able to share some of my newer research, which is really just a sort of smorgasbord, if you will, of this history. So I'm going to go ahead and take my Alrighty, move this little guy right there. All right, let's kick this lecture off. So today, as I said, we'll be talking about sugar, slavery, and revolution, the real history of white gold. So as a food historian, I can understand, and I totally have a command of the fact that sugar has transformed the world's cuisine. I can't think of anything that I eat now, and I know I'm an American, so our sugar consumption is through the roof, but that has not been in some way or another touched by sugar. As a scholar of the African diaspora and the Atlantic world, I know that sugar was a primary factor in the transatlantic slave trade. So I understand that it's tightly tethered as one of the main factors in that forced migration of 12.5 million enslaved Africans from the western and central coast of Africa to the, quote, New World. And as somebody who's completely obsessed with material culture, as an archaeologist, as a material culture, aficionado, I understand as well that sugar itself also introduced new objects into our cultures. And that to me is one of the more fascinating bits that I had an incredible time exploring. So as a cultural historian, I also know that sugar is the most fascinating commodity during the colonial era. So tonight's lecture is going to start with literally the seeds, the early seeds of sugar. And I'm going to bring you all right up to the end of the 18th century. If you want to learn more about sort of the long history of sugar, of course, you can read lots of books, or you can get my Audible book where I go on into the 21st century. All right, fun facts. Are you ready for this? Americans consume about 100 pounds of sugar a year. And I have to say, personally, I probably consumed a few pounds this last week when I was at the Heritage Chocolate Society meeting in Colonial Williamsburg, where they gave us so much chocolate and so much sugar over a 2-day period that I think I left in some sort of coma. But we consume, as Americans, we consume more per capita than any other country in the world. And I just want you to think for a minute. When I started thinking critically about sugar, I imagined life without sugar. All of the drinks that I drink, right? The liquor that I love, rum, even, wines that I drink. Port is another one that I'm a huge fan of. Juice, right? All of these things have added sugar to them, as well as things like birthday cakes and wedding cakes and graduations. I mean, I can't imagine Easter without Easter candy. So when you start thinking about sugar and how pervasive it is, it's kind of overwhelming. And the history of it is bittersweet, right? It's one of our favorite things to consume. We were hardwired as humans, as we evolved, to crave sugar, to want sugar. And so it fed not only a natural instinct to have that energy burst, but when it became one of the largest commodities in human history, it also fed things like greed, which we'll be talking about tonight. So before we trace its path across the world, I want to just talk a little bit about what sugar actually is. You see these little sort of, grasses right here. So sugar is part of the saccharum family. It's a long reed grass. There's multiple different strains of sugar. It's a seed-bearing grass as well. So seeds sort of, just like regular grasses go, it sort of self-seeds itself. It takes about 6 to 24 months, depending on the location, the quality of soil, the sun, the water, etc., to go from a seed to full-grown sugarcane. And that's a really important tidbit to hang on to, because we talk about the labor that happened on those plantations. That's a very important thing to remember. It also grows in subtropical terrains. So if you looked at the planet Earth and the equator, imagine it had a really big belt around it. That's the area, above and below the equator where sugar grows the most and the best. It's also the third most valuable crop in the world today, which is kind of insane, but not really when you start thinking about what it's added to and the ways in which we're all somewhat, in some ways, addicted to sugar itself. So where did it all start? Let's talk about those early seeds of sugar. So around, and this is, again, I'm a historian of colonial America, so this is, way out of my time frame, but around 9,000 to 8,000 BCE, it was farmed in what we now call Papua New Guinea. It's it's actually the second largest island in the world, and it's in the Western Pacific, north of Australia. Indigenous inhabitants in Papua New Guinea learned how to domesticate the crop, and they would eat it raw, as we do sometimes now. And I've seen a lot of sugarcane farmers as well just kind of cut some cane and chew on it raw, and that was how they would consume it. They would literally just cut and chew the cane. By about 1200 BCE, it made its way to China and Southeast Asia, and then Philippines and India a little bit earlier. The dates when I started doing this research were all over the place. And so I really had to, I mean, it's, I had to cross-check a million sources and try to figure out a pretty broad range of dates that I could claim where these moments happened, where sugar actually migrated to these places. And it was definitely one of the more challenging parts of my research. But sugar began being processed into crystals, which is how we think of it now, in India around 350 Common Era, so CE, and they called it sharkara, and that's an original Sanskrit name for ground material. So what was once just, cane that you would chew on, then became this wonderful crystallized substance that could literally bag up and ship across the world. And that's really when sugar became one of the most profitable objects in this early period. So before there was sugar, humans, got their sugar kick from things like fruit and honey. By the 7th century CE, sugar crystals began being transported across the Silk Road. The Silk Road that was an east, and it continues to be an east-west route from from Asia through the Middle East to the Mediterranean. And this is where most of the food was being transported during this period. And the cuisines, I mean, as a side note, the cuisine along the Silk Road is something that I would love to spend a good year or so just traveling along and eating all the different influences, because that was literally the main highway of goods during this era. So even before it hit the Silk Road, sugars were rumored by many people. People had heard about sugar, something that was sweet but not fruit, sweet but not honey. Even as early as Alexander the Great's time, one of his members of his army ran across it in 326 BCE in the conquest of India and mentioned it. And his officer said, this is wonderful, "There is a reed in India that brings forth honey without the help of bees, from which an intoxicating drink is made, though the plant bears no fruit." So you can imagine the sort of discovery of this sweet, sweet substance that is not a fruit and not from honey. And a lot of people during this period as well were using sugar as medicine. So it's also a really important sort of factoid as we think about sugar and its early uses. So sugar began its trek towards the west on established trade routes such as the Silk Road. And people obviously began to fall in love with it, as we all do. I think most people remember, the first time they had a certain kind of cake or dessert that they fell in love with. Sugar is something that, again, we are hardwired to like. And because it is so associated with nostalgia in our cultures, it develops this kind of insatiable desire to consume sugar in all of its forms. So this is so cool. So in the Middle East, they started mixing sugar with things like almond paste, and that's where marzipan came from. And I can't even imagine the moment, because that's my favorite flavor on earth. I think almonds are heavenly. You mix that with some sugar. I could literally eat marzipan by the spoon. It's disgusting. I don't even like sweet things, but there's something absolutely intoxicating about marzipan. So they started mixing it with marzipan and selling it to very wealthy people. Egypt became known very quickly for their highly processed version of sugar. It was called the whitest sugar around. So they had a highly processed version of sugar that was really popular because it looked like snow. During the Muslim conquest of Spain and Sicily, they brought the crops around the 9th century to places, again, like Spain and Sicily, and they started growing sugarcane in those regions. During the Middle Ages War, the Crusades, which you see an image here in front of you, during the Crusades, they referred to sugar as sweet salt. So salt had been around forever. Salt was essential in drying meats and preserving all different kinds of food objects, and they called it a sweet salt. So at that point as well, it very much resembled a salt-like substance, a dry, coarse powder, if you will, that was used to add to food to consume. I love this slide. All right, so Venice had a really strong hold on all of the food trade as well. And they would sell things like marzipan and sugar to the most wealthy people in the world. And as one of the largest sort of ports in that part of the world, they really had a handle on the crossroads of sugar production into Europe and other places. Speaking of Europe and other places, there's a reference of King Henry III getting his first taste of the sweet treat. And he, excuse me, spent $450 in today's money on 3 pounds of sugar. So this was not a cheap sort of treat to have. You know, it wasn't like getting a sugar packet free at the 7-Eleven down the street. Sugar was something that was a delicacy beyond, you know, anything you could imagine. And so you have this man here, King Henry III, spending up to $450 for a 3-pound bag or cone of sugar, which I find pretty fascinating. So Europe pretty much had, you know, a supply chain coming in through Venice and other ports. And it was a really easy way for them to start sort of feeding their appetite for sugar. The wealthiest of these nations, of these places, were able to get a hold of sugar for their special events and just to sort of spoil themselves. And then in 1453, the Ottoman Empire decided that they were going to conquer Constantinople. And they disrupted the flow of sugar. And you can imagine the chaos that must have happened when everyone's new addiction, whether it be the money from the sugar or just the object itself, the food itself, was cut off. So when this stopped everything, Europeans started to freak out. They needed to have a supply of sugar, and they were trying to figure out exactly what was going to happen because most of Europe was not in that belt that could grow sugar the way that other places could. So there was a bit of a sort of frantic response to this blockage of the sugar trade. And that is where Portugal stepped in. Portugal had an idea. They had many ideas. We'll be talking about some of those later, some quite horrible. So Portugal had an idea. They had already introduced sugarcane into the island of Madeira, and they were growing the crop fairly successfully. They had started making wine there, which was also sweetened with the sugar cane and sent across the, excuse me, up north to different places in, excuse me, in Europe, as well as parts of West Africa. They had made contacts pretty early on. And so they decided that they were going to expand their smaller crops of sugar and make it one of their most dominant crops that they would have to export. So they set up a system and they expanded that as well to the Canary Islands and parts of West Africa. And what they did is they would grow it on the islands and on those different places, the Canary Islands as well as parts of West Africa. Then they would ship the cane after it was cut to Antwerp, where it would be processed. And that's a very important tidbit, which we'll get back to later on. So between 1455, right, a few years after that trade route was cut, between 1455 and 1480, Madeira itself, the Portuguese colony of Madeira, had 70 ships going back and forth between Madeira and Antwerp. So this was really the foundations of what became the transatlantic slave trade and the trade to the, quote, New World shortly after. Speaking of that, let's take a second and talk about this guy. All right, so sugar fever was happening, spice fever was happening all over Europe. There was a craving for not just the edibles, but also just the money involved in this trade. And this all set the stage for none other than Mr. Cristoforo Colombo. I like to call him that and not Christopher Columbus. And it set the stage for him to bargain, you know, the story, with the King and Queen of Spain to, you know, find a route to India, right? We've all heard this story a million times. If you don't know the real story of Christopher Columbus, I highly recommend reading his diary, which is quite telling about sort of his state of mind during all of this. So we all know he got lost. You know, 5 weeks later, he ended up bumping into the Bahamas. And he, you know, the rest is history, you know, the whole story about that. But a second trip across the Atlantic, which was only a year later in 1493, he brought with him sugarcane. from the Canary Islands. So he knew, or somebody knew, to put sugarcane on that boat. And the first harvest of sugar in the Western Hemisphere was in 1501 on the island of Hispaniola, which is now split between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. So we're going to switch now and pivot and start talking about the Atlantic world. This is where my passion kicks in. This is where I literally spend my days and nights thinking about this world that once was, that was so traumatic for so many people and so absolutely transformative for the history of the world. So the Atlantic world was literally this, this collision of cultures. There was greed, there was conquest, it was about colonization, it was about risk-taking, it was about enslavement, and it was about crime and punishment. This world was established very early on by the Portuguese and the Spanish, and the ways in which they decided to start colonizing parts of the, quote, Americas. So we had these intersections. We had Europeans wanting to colonize. It was all about capitalistic greed. The Spanish wanted to go take all the gold out of the mines. I mean, there was this sort of fever of these people trying to make it rich and make a name for themselves during this period. And then, of course, West Africans were involved in this. At the time of the first sort of ships going across the Atlantic, there were major wars happening between different empires in West and Central Africa. And it was because these wars were occurring that set up a stage for those parts of the world to then start selling prisoners of war into the transatlantic slave trade. So, it was a very, very sort of perfect storm for this massive exploitation of these people who were then sent, and I'll get to their story in a moment, into the African diaspora. And it was also an intersection of the indigenous people whose land was being taken, whose resources were being pillaged. And there was a very, every colonizer had a different relationship with the indigenous communities. And it's one of those things, I can't spend too much time on it right now, but when you start looking at the ways in which, colonization happened in these areas, especially during this early period, there was flat out genocide happening in a lot of these regions. And we cannot forget that. So this set the stage for a violent conquest that forever changed our world history. In 1501, the first harvest of sugar was done in Hispaniola, and all of a sudden, everybody realized that sugar was about to become the king of the trade. Let's talk about this trade for a moment. People call it the triangle trade. It was not a triangle. It was a lot more messy than that. I think humans like to simplify things into shapes, into one-liners. It's only getting worse as time goes on. But the trade was between different European nations, West and Central African kingdoms and queendoms and people, as well as indigenous groups in the, quote, new colonies. And this trade, and also as well as colonizers in the new colonies as well. And this trade was responsible for the enslavement, the capture and enslavement of an estimated 12.5 million African people. And that term African people, I think, is somewhat problematic just because it erases their ethnicity. We're talking about people who belong to different empires, that came from royalty, that had distinct and powerful communities that were wealthy and had their own sort of cultural traditions. These were not just blank slates ready to come and be turned into enslaved people in the colonies. And again, I speak a lot about that in my other work, but it's really important to understand as well that when the initial contact was happening with the West African people from the Portuguese and then from the Spanish and then later other European nations, this was all part of warring states in the different nations and empires in West Africa. So they were selling off prisoners of war. By the time the 1600s rolled around, right, 100 years after that first crop of sugar was successfully grown in Hispaniola, you start seeing the slave trade also drastically change. It turns from something that's just selling off prisoners of war to an active and very, impactful sort of problem that was happening there, where you actually have people being kidnapped and just mass chaos on the different areas in West Africa. So they would be These enslaved Africans would be sold into the slave trade, not realizing where they were going to end up going. The mortality rate on these ships as they crossed the Atlantic was incredibly high. They estimate between 1 to 2 million enslaved Africans died before reaching the ports in the, quote, New World. By 1500, the Portuguese and Spanish were ready to grow sugar, right? And they started trying to enslave indigenous people, and it didn't work out too well. A lot of the indigenous people ended up dying. A lot of them just pure, straight out resisted. And it was also their country, their nation. They knew exactly where to run and to hide. You know, the sort of constant march inward from the coast, from these European colonizers, could not outpace some of the native groups who were able, and even still to this day, to be able to have some space that's theirs that has not been colonized yet. So these enslaved people that were captured and sold off, these men, women, and children, had no idea the kind of labor or, you know, culture that they were going to be forced into once they got to the plantations of the Western Hemisphere. This image right here is pretty phenomenal. It is the earliest drawn image of a sugar plantation. It is definitely not very racialized. There's sort of bodies there, sort of, you know, without race, etc., doing the work. But what you can see here is sort of the complexity and sort of all the things that had to happen to get sugar turned into something to sell. So by 1540, 30 years after the first harvest in Hispaniola, there were 800 sugar mills. 800 sugar mills established on just one of Brazil's islands. So Brazil's Santa Catarina Island alone had 800 sugar mills. That is insane to think about, right? In 1550, there were over 3,000 mills cumulatively between the Spanish and the Portuguese sugar colonies, which is just absolutely incredible. And when you think about the amount of money that was producing, and you think about what cost that was to the people who were enslaved on those plantations, it's quite dramatic. So by 1700, there came a very common saying, and it's a depressing one, but it's very much in line with this bust and sort of burst that was happening with the sugar economy. It goes like this: without sugar, no Brazil. Without slaves, no sugar. Without Angola, no slaves. The interconnectedness of slavery and sugar and colony was completely cemented to one another. There was no going back, right? This was absolutely part of this capitalistic sort of system that was being established to make a lot of money for a very small percentage of people. The Spanish, as I mentioned earlier, were deep in the game very early on. Spain had they wanted to go and take all the gold and silver out of the mines, and they did a pretty good job doing that in South America and Central America during their early years. But at some point, they realized as well that, excuse me, at some point they realized as well that they had to turn to something else. And so they also then quickly pivoted towards just working with some sugar, and then as well as a couple of other agricultural ventures, to then working almost exclusively on sugar. Just give me 1 second here. All right, let's talk about the Portuguese. So both Spain and Portugal were in early, as I said, and they were the last to come out. So Portuguese established Brazil. They colonized Brazil, and it was still is to this day one of the most sort of Afrocentric in terms of cultures that you see within the diaspora. There are more African traditions. There are more African religious practices in Brazil than anywhere else outside of the continent of Africa, which is pretty amazing. But that is because of the percentage of enslaved people and the sheer numbers of enslaved people who were brought directly from West Africa in Central Africa to Brazil by the Portuguese. So, pretty soon you have Spain and Portugal spending 100 years sort of establishing what this plantation complex is going to look like. And, they spent from 1501 all the way up into, 1600, sort of really, mastering the ways in which to completely commodify and abuse this whole situation. So chattel slavery, plantation labor was very much attached to the production of sugar. Spain didn't emancipate their enslaved labor force completely until 1886, and Brazil didn't until 1888. There were illegal ships coming into all of the colonies, as we know, well after that. But by 1600, Spain and Portugal, their colonies outpaced and crushed the Mediterranean market on sugar. So within 100 years, they completely took over the world market to feed the European nations and a lot of the Mediterranean with the sugar coming from the, quote, New World. Excuse me. All right, so enslaved Africans were sold at different locations. So you would be put onto a boat, and if you survived the Middle Passage, which took about 3 months from shore to shore, you would arrive at a port and you would be sold off. You would be broken up from your families. If you were put on a ship with your family, you would be examined at port. You would be branded by either the slaver themselves to mark the kind of enslaved person you were, whether you were from a certain place in West Africa, or you would also sometimes get branded by the company that traded you. You can look up some of these brands online. They're incredibly terrifying to see. These groups of West African people spoke different languages. They were a diverse group. They practiced different religions, and some of them were even enemies with one another. But you can imagine once you ended up in a strange land where literal torture was going on, I'll be talking about that in a moment, you end up developing very strong community ties. And this is where you see the essence, the legacy of that playing out throughout the African diaspora even today. So the Caribbean was used, and South America was used to do what's called seasoned slaves. So they would be put onto a sugar plantation. They would be then broke by an overseer. They would be taught, quote, how to be a good slave. And it was in these moments where a lot of people ended up giving up. And it was a very tragic, tragic moment for millions of enslaved Africans and their descendants. So it was a literal landscape of terror. And I'm going to talk a little bit in a moment about what actually went into creating the sugar that people knew and loved so much. But before I do that, I do want to take a moment to talk about the actual people. These are two stunning paintings that I found. They're from Brazil, 1641. And I want to just take a moment to put a face, right, to the people that we're talking about right now. Who are these men, women, and children that were forced to labor in these sugar plantations? So thanks to a German mercenary named, Zacharias Wagner, he worked for the Dutch West India Company, which was very much involved in the slave trade. He painted these from a copy of an Albert Eckert sort of painting, and this Albert's person lived in Brazil from 1637 to 1644 and documented these kinds of scenes, which is fantastic for us now as historians. And Wagner said, I quote, "Black women are not spared having to work in an exhausting manner in the mills and cane fields, just as the men and children do." And what I think struck me about that is not that the African women were forced to work. It's that he was so struck by the fact that they have to do this harsh work as well, that all of the cultural norms that existed in many parts of European cultures were completely thrown out when it came to the ways in which these enslaved people were treated. And this is just the beginning. So let's go ahead and zoom right into the British Caribbean. Fast forward a little bit, let's sort of tie this a little bit closer to Virginia, to what we think of as more of our world history. I want to talk about Barbados, which is one of my favorite places on earth. I actually, as a reward for doing this work, some of us went to Barbados this last summer. It was quite striking to go to a place, and I'd been there before, but having done the research and read about the slave revolts and read about the abuse and read about the sort of textural history, the cultural history of these islands, and then to go be in that space was incredibly sobering. It's not, I don't travel to these places to go to sandals resorts. I go and I talk to local historians and I visit sites and I really sort of dip into what's left of this very important history of our world. So 100 years, after Portugal and Spain colonized, the English decide to sort of jump in the game, right? They were late to the party. Jamestown, of course, 1607, they had their failed mission in Roanoke. But in 1625, just a few years after the Jamestown settlement, King James claimed the island of Barbados. This island is 21 by 14 miles wide, and it is the easternmost island in the Caribbean, and that was ideal for trading with the Eastern Hemisphere. So this is what I absolutely found fascinating. So within 5 years, the sugar mills were completely functioning on the island. So that was the first thing they did, was establish sugar mills. Of course, they were trying to grow tobacco and that didn't work out too well. But when I was doing this research and I was reading certain books like Sugar Barons, etc., and some of the narratives of this era, it was very clear to me the kind of people that ended up going to the Caribbean. And I backed up a little bit. So I was thinking about, the sort of terror that I know that happened on these sugar plantations. And I was thinking about the planters that were down there and sort of who would decide to go to Barbados over Virginia. And, now we think about that, and Barbados is a beautiful country. There's beaches, there's everything you could ever imagine there. But at the time, it was actually a huge risk. The Caribbean, in so many ways, was like the Wild West of the colonies. So people that ended up coming to the quote New World had a choice to make. They could go to a place like Virginia or Massachusetts, and they could kind of be in the space that had very established governments, or they could take a ticket and they could go to somewhere like Barbados, which literally drew in some of the most vile human beings that ever left England. So people like the criminally insane, prostitutes that had gotten in so much trouble that they had to be kicked out of England, prisoners were sent there as well. You have just, the kind of people that want to risk it all. So it was known to these people who were going to colonize Barbados, they could make it big. Sugar was gold. Everybody knew that by the time the 1600s rolled around. So the people that went were the same kind of, risk takers that would go blow their whole retirement in Vegas. I mean, these people really wanted to get out there, make it rich, and do it in a place that did not have the same kind of stability, if you will, that you see in the mainland colonies. And so, Barbados, the Caribbean, these kinds of places really became a place where you could go reinvent yourself. And so the stories that you can read through about, the taverns and things and the different, bars that you would go into in the hotels, and people just surrounded by, people of ill repute. I mean, I would love to go back and just sort of dip into that space and sort of see who were hanging out in those spaces and what was actually happening. So one such Caribbean colonizer was a man named Sir James Drax and his brother William. They established Drax Hall in the center of the island. They started farming, or not themselves, they started having enslaved people farm tobacco for them right when they first got there. But around 1642, they decided that they wanted to switch to sugarcane because that was what you did in these places. You could grow it well, and that's how you would make it big. So Sir James Drax traveled to Brazil, and he learned farming techniques from the Brazilians, and he also learned the technology of the mills from the Dutch. So it was a very complicated sort of recipe and learning how to actually, institute a sort of farming technique, etc., as well as getting the wind and the water done by the windmills. So it was a very complicated setup, which he learned and succeeded at very well. So by the 1650s, sugar became the primary crop in Barbados. It was, without question, a sugar colony. By 1642, Sir James Drax at Drax Hall he started out with 22 enslaved Africans. By 1650, only 8 years later, he had over 200 enslaved Africans working for him for his wealth on this plantation. So by 1700, sugar was king throughout the subtropic colonies, the Caribbean, parts of South America, and even up into places like Florida, more so later than during this period. So of the 19 British West Indian colonies, 14 of them were dominated by the sugar trade. The byproducts of sugar, things like molasses and rum, two things that I'm completely in love with, way more than sugar. Those things as well, those byproducts made up 98% of the exports out of Barbados. So a lot of the money was coming from rum and molasses, in addition to just the sugar cane itself. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the sort of social and political and cultural elements of sugar. I'm going to talk a little bit about the crime, the nitty gritty, right? The kinds of things that you'd hear about if you were hanging out with those prostitutes in Bridgetown in 1683. So first I want to talk about pirates. Everybody loves a good pirate story. The more and more I was diving into this, the more and more I wanted just to give up my whole career and study pirates forever and go run away and live in Barbados or something. But I haven't done that. So that's a good thing, I guess, for Stratford, if nothing else. But pirates played a huge role in the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, the same way that the Atlantic world was this, large sort of passageway for all the different colonizers to sort of, travel across and sort of run across each other and sort of take over the world. This particular part of the world, the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, was riddled with pirates. Literally, it was like dropping in, a small fish into a shark tank. It was really hard to get through and get to the ports because there were so many pirates. So they were either on their own, which were called pirates, people that were just, their own pirate ship, their own crew, and they would target all the ships, right? They didn't have really a political agenda. It was more about taking things and becoming rich and just being scoundrels, which, everybody loves a good scoundrel story. So, but some of them were hired as privateers by people like the Crown, to attack and steal from other nations. And this is where things get really, really interesting. Pirates absolutely did love rum. And if you think about it, how could they not love rum when it was, if they get a ship coming from Barbados, there's a 98% chance that there's going to be a lot of rum on it. And it also, makes you relax a little bit when you're on the waters. So pirates basically that had a license from the Crown were called privateers. And in the 17th century, which, the 1600s, there were alone, just in England's Port Royal in Jamaica, in the 1600s, there were 1,000 pirates hanging out, operating out of that one port. That is one port and that is one colony. So you can imagine sort of what those seas might have looked like. These pirate crews were motley. I think that's an understatement. They were made up of all different kinds of criminals. They were made up of men and women. They had all different ethnicities and races. They were basically outcasts of society that wanted to then go pillage ships and take the same kinds of risks that you think of when you watch things like Pirates of the Caribbean, right? It's very much that dramatic. There's some great pirate stories out there that you can find yourself. And I highly recommend, looking at some of the more critical work on pirates because it's quite fantastic. But let's talk about one pirate in particular. All right, now this picture really made me laugh. So, of course, we've all seen Captain Morgan. We know the rum. It's absolutely not my favorite rum, not even close. But this over on the right here is said to be Captain Morgan himself. He looks nothing like the cartoon version of him on the left. When I saw this originally, I got the giggles because I felt like he looked like a very young, innocent, sweet man. Nothing about him, maybe young at one point, was sweet or innocent. Let me tell you a little bit about this particular pirate, Captain Morgan himself. So He was actually ended up being called Sir Henry. He was knighted. I'll talk about that in a minute. Sir Henry Morgan. His story is really fascinating. He was born to the son of a Welsh farmer in 1635. He got into some trouble, shocker there. He got into some trouble, and he was then sent off as an indentured servant to Barbados. After he served his term, he was hanging out in one of those bars, and he was recruited by a pirate crew. Shocker. So he decides that he wants to be part of a pirate crew. And by the late 1660s, his successful booty hauls, for lack of a better phrase, were so well received that he actually got a letter of marque from the British government to be a privateer. So he was then hired by the British government to go attack Spain's ships as they came into the Caribbean and came into the Gulf of Mexico. He became so notorious because of his unethical war tactics. I mean, disgusting. The stories associated with him honestly make me not want to drink Captain Morgan alone. I don't really drink it anyways, but let me tell you what this guy was known for. It's pretty crazy. So one of the things that really got him into some trouble, even at this level, is that he invaded the Spanish settlement of Portobello in 1668. And he directed his crew to burn a naked woman at the stake because she wouldn't confess to where the money was. So this is the kind of scoundrel this guy was. I mean, he was literally, nothing sweet and innocent. That picture on the right is not a good representation of his personality. He was also notorious for using elderly people, women, and monks for shields in war. So this man would direct his crew and himself use elderly people, women, and monks as human shields when he went into battle. I think one of the most visual and sort of vivid things that I read about one of his accounts was that during his siege of Gibraltar, he took a Portuguese man and he strung him up in 4 posts, hanging him by his thumbs and his toes. And he yanked him almost apart for hours. Then, if that was not enough, he took this man and he smashed him with a 200-pound stone while burning his face with a lit palm leaf. This is Captain Morgan, everybody on the Zoom call. That is a pretty despicable dude. So these kinds of acts were reported. Of course, it took a while to get back by ship. He was briefly punished, but shocker, King Charles III knighted him and sent him back to Barbados, where he became one of the wealthiest sugar planters on the island. He very quickly established 3 sugar plantations in Jamaica, where he enslaved hundreds and hundreds of enslaved African people. So again, these intersections of pirateering, of slavery, of thievery are very much tethered to the history of sugar. So let's talk a little bit about what it was like. What would it have been like to be on Sir Drax or Captain Morgan's plantation, or anybody else for that matter? So sugar plantations were seen as a death sentence. It was something that people dreaded, they talked about. The sort of mortality rate was absolutely through the roof. It was so bad that sugar was a huge topic and sort of fire that lit the larger abolitionist movement that was then brought to British Parliament because of the atrocities that British people saw when they went to visit the plantations throughout the Caribbean, the sugar plantations. They reported back some of the things that they saw. So the pro-sugar, pro-slavery people argued that the high mortality rate and all of these complaints that they were hearing back in England had to do with not the fact of abuse and sort of and torture, but more about the fact that it was a frontier lifestyle, right? That, disease was rampant, it was the tropics, etc. It didn't hold out, obviously, very well. But the abolitionists documented these things. They pushed, and I'm going to show you in a little bit here some of the ways that they advertised some of these political themes in the material culture. So it was a harsh environment. We see in the records that it was known to be cheaper to replace enslaved people than to worry about their health and wellness on these plantations. Excuse me, they died at record rates from infection, from injury, just from working themselves to death. They literally worked 18 hours a day in the tropical sun with very little time to sleep. So in 1672, King Charles II, the same guy that made Captain Morgan a hero, established the Royal African Company for the sole purpose of supplying enslaved Africans to sugar plantations. So this really kicked up the slave trade as well, in a way that hadn't been before. So even within the British Caribbean, between 72 and 1689, there were over 100,000 enslaved men, women, and children just brought only by the Royal African Company. The Royal African Company also had its own brand, which you can find images of online. So the Royal African Company had a 17-year monopoly, excuse me, on the trade. And then the Sugar Islands became literal graveyards for slaves. That's a quote from British scholar Alan Rice. And again, Sugar Islands became a literal graveyard for the slaves. It was known throughout the world how brutal it was working on these plantations. Once you were on a plantation, of course, you had to do everything from planting the seeds, the 24-month process that would take, thousands of enslaved people to create that amount of profit for their enslavers. You would work 12 to 18 hours a day. And, excuse me, and what you started to see as well is that they would use these plantations, as I mentioned earlier, to break or, quote, season enslaved people. So some enslaved folks were brought to sugar plantations. Before then, they were sold up to places like Virginia and South Carolina, where they would literally advertise them as enslaved people coming from the Caribbean, coming from the Sugar Islands, coming from places where they were, quote, seasoned and ready to then work on a tobacco or a wheat or a cotton plantation in the British North America. One of the things that I think is most gruesome is you see this slide right here. Excuse me, this right here is from 1722, and you see these big grinding stones. There were stories that I read, countless ones, of enslaved people getting their arms and limbs caught in those grinding stones. And if you see, it would either be powered by people or by animals. And those stones would just grind. And it was all about getting as much done as possible. You didn't have a long window to process the sugar once it was cut. There was an urgency that was then enforced by the overseers to make sure you're working at a certain pace. And that is what mutilated so many enslaved people working on these plantations. Excuse me. I want to take a moment and read a quote from one of my favorite people in history, Mary Prince, who was enslaved in a lot of places, but she spent some time in Bermuda. And she said about the abuse that she witnessed on these sugar plantations, quote, "I have often wondered how English people can go out into the West Indies and act in such a beastly manner. When they go to the West Indies, they forget God and all feelings of shame. They tie up people like hogs, moor them up like cattle, and they lick them, so as hogs or cattle or horses never were flogged." And so when you start to read into this and you start to really kind of dive deep into the history of the labor that was involved, of the men and women and children, sugar becomes less and less sweet as you move on through the history. The interior of a boiling house as well is a place that was very tragic for a lot of people. You can imagine the kind of work that had to happen to boil down the sugar. Now, boiling was important for all byproducts of sugar cane, whether it was rum, whether it was molasses, whether it was the loaves that were shipped across the world. And these large vats, I don't know if anybody listening has been to a plantation where they still do this in the Caribbean or anywhere else. You see these large cauldrons boiling, and it is one of the most terrifying things I've ever seen. So I spent a good 15 years studying this before I went to Grenada about 10 years ago, where I went to the oldest working, still operating rum distillery in the Western Hemisphere. And I saw the size of these cauldrons, and it's like a small swimming pool, some of them. So they would be boiling hot water, not hot water, I'm sorry, boiling hot sugar, rum, etc. And I want to read this one quote right here, because it also, again, it's from the period, and it really sort of taps in to the kinds of things that you would see if you were going back in time and visiting one of these sites. This is by a man named Benjamin Mahoney, and he was doing some work at Worthy Park Plantation in Jamaica during the 18th century. And he said, I walked into the boiling house and there saw 3 men out of the 4 boiler men with handkerchiefs round their bodies instead of trousers, and all besmeared with blood. I had some conversation with them, as no bookkeeper was present, and they told me they were obliged to wet the handkerchiefs frequently to keep them from adhering to and drawing in their raw and inflamed flesh, which always gave intolerable pain. There are records of people being thrown into these vats as punishment and dying in the boiling sugar. So if you really want to learn more about some of the horrors of this, check out a man named Thomas Thistlewood's diaries, and you will get more than you would ever want to read about some of the horrors of these sites. Rum and molasses, let's not forget the byproducts. They became central to the trade as well. The story of rum is pretty fascinating, and I love telling it. So there's lots of different sort of presumed origin stories of one of our favorite liquors, but the one that I tend to believe is the most correct comes out of Barbados sometime around the 1640s. And the story is that there was the sugar plantation, right? And there were enslaved Africans working on this plantation. And these enslaved Africans had a long tradition of making things like palm wine in their native home in West Africa. And so they would process the sugar as they were told to by the overseer. And then they basically would just throw away all of the leftover sugar cane after they would press the sugar out of it. And what they did is they would start taking the leftover, the byproduct, excuse me, of the sugar, and they would ferment it outside and make a liquor out of it. And very quickly, the plantation elite realized what was happening, and they tasted it, and their rum was born. There's a lot of really fun sort of stories about the origin of its name, etc., which I won't get into, but rum is very much part of the history of sugar and part of the history of the Atlantic world. So enslaved people were actually given 10% of the rum allotments that were shipped out. It was typically given to them on Easter and Christmas and New Year's Eve. And it was a way to try to, and I'll talk about revolts in a minute, ease some of the tensions that were constantly brewing on these sites. Really fun fact before I move to the next slide and the next topic, which is material culture, is that New England actually was a thriving rum area as well, and no one thinks about that. But before the American Revolution, there were a bunch of rum distilleries throughout places like Massachusetts and Rhode Island, and they all shut down after the Revolution because of politics, and then we sort of turned to whiskey as our go-to liquor in the United States. All right, let's pivot on over to material culture. As I said, I love culture of white gold, of course, etc. Hold on here. It says my internet is unstable, so I just want to give
Kelley,
it a second.
You just cut out for like a few seconds there.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
All right, start over. Sugar stuff, material culture of white gold. So I am also obsessed with material culture. I think that it's one of the most fascinating ways to look at behaviors and wants and desires of people then and now. And so I want to go over a couple of things that really sort of signify the importance of sugar on a dining room table of some of the rich folks that were enjoying this wonderful, wonderful commodity. So what you find during the colonial era is this spike in material culture created literally to show off your sugar. It's completely tied in with conspicuous consumption. And you see things like this absolutely stunning 18th century multi-silver covered sugar box, of which would have been placed out on display during a tea service or a coffee service. And also just think about the ways in which, you know, coffee and tea consumption and chocolate consumption skyrocketed with the inclusion of sugar as well. So sugar transforms, you know, food stuff, and it also transforms these elite people's dining rooms and the performance of wealth and sophistication. This is something that I also absolutely loved reading about. These are, excuse me, sugar boxes or salettes, if you will, or a sugar chest. These things would be, they were made to hold and store sugar. So you would open that thing up and there would be nice little sort of, like you would find like a case of wine. You would find, you know, wooden separation sort of walls where you would then put the sugar cones in and the sugar loaves like you see right here. And these things would be literally very prominently placed within a dining space, because if you had one of these, you were not only wealthy enough to have sugar, but you were about to have a whole ceremony that involved the sugar tongs and the, you know, and the spoons and the casters like these as well. I need myself one of these. I just have to say, this thing is killer. So just like, oh, before I go that, let me talk about loaves for 1 second. I know that there was some excitement on some Facebook chat about some loaves, and I want to just talk about loaves for 1 second. So sugar would come to the colonies in things like these sugar loaves. They would be small, something like a 5-inch sort of block cone, if you will. They would weigh about 5 pounds, and they would sell for about 7 shillings, which is today about $50 during the 18th century. They also had really big ones as well, and they were about 50 pounds. They were huge and they were less refined. So it's actually, funny enough, it was more expensive per pound, if you will, to get the smaller sugars because they were more refined and a higher quality, where if you got a big old loaf of sugar, it was less refined. And I mean, in some ways probably tasted better because it wasn't refined. I've gotten to the point as I've gotten older where I love just raw, you know, sugar as close to the actual cane as possible. But pretty interesting. They would boil the sugar and they would filter it to create a sort of white look. They would use things like egg whites, excuse me. And this is what cracked me up. Some people actually used ox blood to filter the sugar, which doesn't seem very intuitive to me, but it's pretty interesting. The sugar caster right here is a wonderful example as well, very popular in the 18th century. I'm gonna keep moving here. Oh, sugar sculptures. These things are fantastic. I do not have time tonight to go into details, but these things were incredibly popular during the 17th and 18th century. And you would have some of the wealthiest people in the world hiring these sugar sculptures to come in there and create these sort of classical themes in history. And here you see wonderful example of Vulcan and Neptune here carved in sugar. So let's talk for a moment. We're going to pivot back to political sort of expressions on material culture. And we're going to talk a little bit about Josiah Wedgwood, who's a really interesting guy. And I'm sure most people have heard of Wedgwood. And if you haven't, you need to go look the ceramics up, but also the story of him himself. So during this period, as I said earlier, people were talking about the morality and the ethics behind the production of sugar. It was no secret that there were horrors happening in these sugar plantations, and that, you know, there was a certain sort of rhetoric around whether or not you were going to believe the stories or not. And you see that kind of rhetoric play out in the material culture. And this is the kind of stuff that really gets me excited. So we have here on the left a 1770s tea caddy, which you have painted on. It's called the Tea Party. It's this image that was printed. It was based on a print by Robert Hancock, and it's all about this romantic plantation scene, right? So say you're somewhere, I don't know, you're in Leicester, England, or you're in Virginia, or somewhere that you're just, you know, detached from the reality of plantation labor on these sugar plantations. And it really presents this kind of romantic, very false idea of, the kind of garden setting and sort of the peacefulness, right? The enslaved servant is over there sort of peacefully standing. You don't see the kind of brutal images that I mentioned a moment ago when I was talking about the actual accounts of enslavement at these plantations. And what's, I think, really interesting about this particular piece is that Josiah Wedgwood, was one of the most popular potters like in the world. I mean, his stuff is fantastic, and you can see it in places like, Washington Lee has one of the most killer collections of some of his stuff. Most importantly, some of his, anti-slavery material and others. But you can see sort of the politics play out through objects, and this is one of them, without question. And then you have later on, in 1787, you have Josiah Wedgwood creating the ultimate symbol of emancipation, of abolition, and this is the pendant here that he was really well known for making. And he was also very much involved in the Society for Effecting Abolition of Slavery. And so you start seeing this image here in all the different variants throughout the colonies as a marker of somebody who is conscious of what's happening on these sugar plantations, and also as somebody who very much does not want to partake in the commodity sort of consumption of these kinds of things. As you see here as well, you've got the sugar bowl, and it says here, East India sugar, not made by slaves. So there was very much a propaganda-esque sort of theme happening with this material culture, very much tethered to the politics and morality of enslavement. You see these kinds of political discussions as well playing out in political cartoons. Right here, this is one of my, I think, most favorite cartoons to talk about this particular moment. This was done This was done in 1791 to really sort of bring attention to the barbarities of the West Indies. And you see here, it says, there's a quote here I will read. It says underneath, that you can't read very well. So what you have here is one of those sugar cauldrons. You have an enslaved person being pushed down by an overseer or maybe a planter of sorts. Up in the background, you see an enslaved person's hand cut off and nailed to the wall next to things like to people's ears, as well as wild animals. And this was a way, it was very provocative. This was a way to really scream as loud as possible, sound the alarm on what was happening in these colonies during a time before convenient media that we have now. And the quote underneath says, among numberless other acts of cruelty daily practiced, an English Negro driver, because the young Negro through sickness was unable to work, threw him into a copper of boiling sugar juice. And you can go ahead and read the rest of it there. So this is very much based on actual things that were happening in these sugar plantations, brought then to an international stage. I'm going to do my last pivot of the evening to sort of talk about the ways in which these enslaved Africans reacted to all of this. They were not idle in their enslavement. They were not docile in their enslavement. They rebelled every moment of their life. So I want to talk about, we talked about the harshness of these sugar plantations, and you can imagine anybody in that situation would want to fight back. So there were major slave revolts, rebellions, revolutions, if you will, throughout these sugar estates. There were more on sugar plantations than any other kind of crop because of the brutality that I've mentioned during this lecture. So places like Antigua, St. John, Jamaica, Louisiana, I mean, everywhere there were plantation economies based on sugar, there were major slave revolts. I had to pick a few for my Audible course because I couldn't spend the entire time talking about that, although I could have easily done that. But what I do want to do is I want to spend a moment tonight before we wrap this up talking about the particular colony of Saint-Domingue. It was a French colony, and it was one of the wealthiest colonies in the world during the 18th century. Saint-Domingue had 500,000 enslaved Africans. right before the revolution. And it was responsible for 30% of the world's sugar supply and half of the world's coffee supply. So I think you all know enough now after my talk tonight to understand what that actually meant in reality to those men, women, and children who were literally bound to those cauldrons. So I'm going to end with a little story. It's a quick one. And again, this is one of those things I could have spent an entire lecture on. But I want to sort of talk about moments in history where there is a breaking point. And there was a breaking point, a perfect storm, if you will, in Saint-Domingue in October of 1790. So there's a free Black man, Haitian man named Vincent Ogue, and he petitioned for voting rights for free Blacks with France, and they rejected it. So at that moment in time, you have a percentage of the population who are free and of African descent, now also despising the French government, along with every enslaved person on that island. So it was a perfect storm. You had race and class completely bound together. By 1791, a group of enslaved Africans attacked a plantation with torches and machetes and hooks. They killed the people there and they burned it to the ground. They wanted freedom. They wanted freedom the same way that Americans wanted freedom during the Revolution, and the same way that countless other enslaved people wanted freedom during their lives that were held in bondage. So within 2 months, there were 100 plantation buildings burned to the ground, gone. You can imagine, this is Napoleon's era as well. You can imagine the fire alarms that were sent across the Atlantic world because there was something very serious happening in Saint-Domingue. There had been other slave revolts, but this one was different. There were leaders that sort of appeared as this went on. People like Toussaint Louverture joined and led the force along with everybody. This was not a one-man battle. This was a war that was fought by men, women, and children for their freedom. And these people, this collective African people who were literally forced to work on those plantations to make that sugar, beat Napoleon. And that, everyone, is where Haiti was born. So slavery, sugar, and revolution are forever tied together. I'm going to end my talk with this beautiful cookie tree from Stratford Hall to think about, again, the sweetness of sugar. People come to my lectures all the time and they want to hear about all the sweet stuff, and I'm sure some of you are a little bummed out that I didn't go over some recipes, but I really wanted to bring a more raw history of this very important ingredient to all of you. I wanted to give credit to those people, acknowledge those people who had to work in those plantations, whose labor literally was given and taken, rather, gave the colonists their wealth, and we continue to benefit from that to this day. This right here is a cookie tree that was made by Amy Connolly, our curator, who's an incredible faux food creator at Stratford Hall. And we have this cookie tower, this cookie tree out during the holidays and other times. But it's important to remember that sugar and sweetness is very much a part of all of our lives. And we have to just remember the full and complete history of the sweet treat. Of course, there's other issues happening now, none as horrific as what I just told. If you're interested in sort of the longer history of slavery, as well as the longer history of sugar, as it went into places like Hawaii, the resistance that happened in places like South Africa, etc. It is in my Audible book. So I'm going to end it here. Thank you all so much for zooming in.